The morning sun cast long shadows across the bustling marketplace in Ouagadougou, the heart of Burkina Faso. The air thrummed with the sounds of commerce, vendors shouting prices for fresh mangoes and ripe tomatoes, children weaving through, the crowd with baskets balanced expertly on their heads, and the rhythmic pounding of mortars grinding spices that filled the air with intoxicating aromas. Steam rose from street-side grills where vendors prepared succulent kebabs and fresh bread, the smoke mingling with the dust kicked up by countless feet traversing the packed earth. Colorful fabrics hung like rainbows from wooden stalls, swaying gently in the warm breeze that carried the scent of jasmine and cooking oil. Women in vibrant boo-boos moved gracefully through the organized chaos, their jewelry catching the sunlight as they negotiated prices with animated gestures. Elderly men sat in the shade of large umbrellas, sipping sweet tea and watching the world pass by with knowing eyes that had seen decades of change in their beloved country. This was more than just a marketplace, it was the beating heart of the Har. Community, where stories were shared, relationships were forged, and the pulse of daily life could be felt in every transaction, every greeting, every shared laugh. Among the sea of people moved a woman of remarkable presence. Her name was Aminata, though few in the market knew this. She glided through the crowd with an elegance that seemed to part the masses naturally, her flowing dress of deep blue fabric adorned with intricate golden patterns that spoke of both tradition and sophistication. Her head was wrapped in a colorful headscarf that framed her face beautifully, and her eyes held a quiet strength that had been forged through years of witnessing both the beauty and harsh realities of life in West Africa. In her hands, she carried a simple woven basket, now filled with fresh vegetables she had carefully selected from various vendors who had served her family for years. What the bustling crowd didn't know was that this graceful woman was married to one of the most powerful and respected men in all of Burkina Faso. She chose to shop in the local markets not out of necessity, but out of a deep connection to her roots and her people. Despite her elevated status, she remained grounded, preferring to walk among the people rather than be driven in luxury vehicles with security details. Today, like many others, she had dismissed her bodyguards and driver, insisting on experiencing the authentic rhythm of the marketplace. She believed in staying connected to the pulse of the nation, understanding the daily struggles and joys of ordinary citizens. This philosophy had always guided her, even as her husband's prominence had grown. As she moved through the market, Aminata exchanged warm greetings with familiar faces, the fruit vendor who always saved the ripest mangoes for her, the elderly woman who sold the finest shea butter in the region, and the young mother who struggled to make ends meet selling handmade jewelry. However, not everyone in the marketplace regarded her with respect and admiration. Leaning against a weathered wooden stall, partially hidden in the shadow of a large canopy, stood a man whose reputation preceded him wherever he went. His name was Malik, and he was a plague upon the peaceful community of traders and shoppers. Malik was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with arms that bore the scars of countless fights and confrontations. His clothes were perpetually dusty and stained, reflecting his careless attitude toward both personal hygiene and social propriety. But it was his eyes that truly revealed his nature. Cold, calculating, and filled with a predatory hunger that made decent people instinctively cross to the other side of the market when they spotted him. For years, Malik had terrorized the marketplace with impunity. He was known for his pattern of harassment, targeting women who appeared vulnerable, stealing from vendors who couldn't fight back, and intimidating anyone who dared to challenge his behavior. His methods were always calculated. He would start with seemingly harmless comments that gradually escalated to physical intimidation and outright assault. The market vendors had long ago learned to simply tolerate his presence, too frightened to report him to authorities who seemed either unwilling or unable to address the problem. Many had witnessed his violence firsthand, the way he would grab women's wrists until they bruised, how he would overturn carefully arranged fruit displays just to watch vendors scramble to save their merchandise, and his habit of following young girls until they fled in terror. Local shop owners had tried banding together against him, but Malik had connections in unsavory places, and his retaliation was always swift and brutal. He had once destroyed an entire week's worth of a widow's pottery after she had dared to tell him to leave her daughter alone. Another time, he had beaten a young man so severely that the victim had spent weeks in the hospital, all because the man had tried to help a woman Malik was harassing. As Malik's eyes fixed on Aminata, a familiar, cruel smile spread across his face. He saw what he perceived as another opportunity. A well-dressed woman who appeared to be alone, someone who might have money or valuables worth taking, or perhaps someone he could intimidate for his own twisted pleasure. Pushing himself away, from the stall with deliberate slowness, Malik began to move through the crowd toward Aminata. His gait was confident, predatory, the walk of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Other market-goers instinctively moved out of his path, their eyes downcast, hoping to avoid drawing his attention to themselves. As he approached, Malik positioned himself directly in Aminata's path, his large frame blocking her way forward. The immediate area around them began to clear as people sensed trouble brewing, but none dared to intervene or even look directly at the unfolding scene. "Well, well, well," Malik said, his voice dripping with false charm and barely concealed menace. "And where do you think you're going, beautiful lady?" His eyes roamed over her appreciatively, taking in her fine clothing and jewelry with the calculating gaze of someone assessing potential profit. Aminata maintained her composure, her training in diplomacy, and years of dealing with difficult situations, serving her well. She attempted to step around him politely, keeping her voice calm and respectful. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. "I need to pass through." But Malik had no intention of making this easy. He sidestepped, once again blocking her path, his grin widening as he sensed what he perceived as submission. This was how it always started, with politeness that he would systematically destroy until his victims were reduced to fear and desperation. "Excuse me?" he mocked, leaning closer so that she could smell the stale alcohol on his breath. "That's all you have to say? No greeting? No respect for someone who's been standing here long before you arrived?" His voice grew louder, ensuring that nearby vendors and shoppers could hear every word. The market around them seemed to hold its breath. Conversations hushed, and even the usual sounds of commerce seemed muted as people pretended not to notice while staying close enough to witness what was unfolding. Aminata's jaw tightened slightly, the only outward sign of her growing frustration and concern. She had encountered difficult people before in her various diplomatic and social roles, but rarely had someone been so blatantly aggressive in public. Still, she maintained her dignity and composure. "I don't want any trouble," she said, her voice remaining calm but gaining a subtle firmness that hinted at the steel beneath her gracious exterior. "Please just let me pass." Malik's laughter was harsh and grating, designed to humiliate and intimidate. He looked around at the growing circle of onlookers, playing to his audience as he had done countless times before. "Too late for that, sweetheart," he sneered, his voice carrying clearly across the market square. "You walked into my territory, and now you're going to show me some proper respect." Without warning, his hand shot out and seized her wrist in a grip that was immediately painful. Aminata's carefully selected vegetables scattered across the dusty ground as her basket fell from her grasp, the bright red tomatoes and fresh greens rolling into the dirt where they would be trampled by feet and cartwheels. The grip was designed to cause pain without leaving immediately visible marks, a technique Malik had perfected through years of practice. His fingers dug into the soft flesh around her wrist, applying pressure to pressure points that would cause maximum discomfort. "You think you can just ignore me?" he growled, pulling her closer so that his face was inches from hers. "You think you're better than me walking around here like some kind of princess?" His free hand gestured dismissively at her fine clothing and jewelry. Several people in the crowd gasped audibly, and a few women covered their mouths in shock. But still, no one moved to intervene. They had all seen what happened to people who crossed Malik, and none were willing to risk becoming his. "Next target!" Aminata's eyes flashed with anger, but she controlled her voice carefully. Despite the pain shooting up her arm from his grip, she refused to show fear or weakness. "I said I don't want trouble," she repeated, but this time her voice carried an edge that suggested she was far from helpless. What Malik couldn't see, what his arrogance and tunnel vision prevented him from noticing, was the sudden change beginning to ripple through the outer edges of the marketplace. Far from where he held Aminata captive, people were beginning to point and whisper with an urgency that had nothing to do with the confrontation he was creating. A convoy of vehicles had arrived at the market's main entrance, their official license, plates and military markings causing an immediate stir among the vendors and shoppers. But it wasn't the vehicles themselves that was causing the excitement. It was the man who emerged from the lead car. Word began to spread through the market like wildfire, passed from person to person in hushed, urgent whispers. "It's him. The president is here. Ibrahim Traoré has come to the market." The news traveled faster than the man himself, creating a wave of anticipation and nervous energy that moved through the crowd. Ibrahim Traoré moved through the marketplace with the confident stride of a man accustomed to respect, but also with the easy manner of someone who genuinely enjoyed connecting with his people. He was dressed simply, eschewing the formal attire that might have created distance between himself and the citizens he served. His security detail flanked him at a respectful distance, close enough to provide protection, but not so close as to create a barrier between him and the people. As he walked, vendors and shoppers alike turned to greet him, their faces lighting up with genuine affection and respect. Children waved shyly from behind their mothers' skirts, and elderly men nodded approvingly at this leader who chose to walk among them rather than simply ruling from a distant palace. But Traoré's relaxed demeanor began to change as he noticed the unusual cluster of people ahead, the way they were standing in a tight circle, their body language suggesting tension and conflict. His experienced eye immediately recognized the signs of trouble, and his pace quickened as his protective instincts kicked in. It was one of his security officers who first spotted the familiar figure at the center of the disturbance. The man touched Traoré's arm gently and pointed ahead, his voice low but urgent. "Sir, isn't that—" Traoré's eyes followed the gesture, and when he saw the scene unfolding ahead of him, his entire demeanor transformed. The easy smile vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of cold fury that made even his own guards take a step back. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and the muscles in his jaw worked as he fought to control his rage. There, in the center of the circle of onlookers, he could see a large man gripping the arm of a woman in a blue dress. Even at a distance, even though her back was turned to him, he recognized the graceful posture, the particular way she held herself even under duress. It was his wife, Aminata, and some fool had dared to lay hands on her. But Traoré's anger wasn't solely about the personal insult to his family. As he took in the scene more completely, he saw the fear in the faces of the surrounding crowd, the way they hung back without intervening, the resigned acceptance that suggested this was not an unusual occurrence. This told him everything he needed to know about the kind of man he was dealing with, a bully, a predator who had been allowed to operate with impunity for far too long. "Who is that man?" he asked his security chief, his voice deadly quiet. "Malik Uedraogo, sir," came the immediate response. "Local troublemaker. Multiple complaints filed against him for harassment, assault, theft. Nothing ever sticks. He has connections, and most victims are too scared to follow through with formal charges." Traoré's eyes never left the scene ahead as he absorbed this information. "Not anymore," he said, his voice carrying a promise of consequences that made his security detail exchange meaningful glances. They had served under Ibrahim Traoré long enough to know that when he spoke in that tone, justice was about to be served. Meanwhile, Malik continued his harassment, oblivious to the storm gathering behind him. His grip on Aminata's wrist tightened. As he pulled her even closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper that only she could hear. "You're going to learn some respect today," he hissed, his breath hot against her ear. "I'm going to teach you what happens to women who think they're too good for men like me." His free hand moved to her shoulder, his intentions becoming increasingly clear and threatening. But Aminata had heard enough. Drawing on reserves of strength and authority that Malik couldn't have imagined, she met his gaze directly, her eyes blazing with a fire that should have warned him he was dealing with no ordinary victim. "No," she said, her voice cutting through, his threats like a blade. "You're the one who doesn't know who you're dealing with." For just a moment, Malik's confident sneer faltered. There was something in her voice, something in the way she looked at him, that suggested he might have made a serious miscalculation. But his arrogance quickly reasserted itself, and he laughed harshly. "Oh, really?" he sneered, jerking her arm roughly. "And who exactly are you supposed to be? Some rich man's trophy wife? Some diplomat's daughter? I've dealt with your type before, princess. Money and connections don't mean anything when you're standing here in my market." But before Aminata could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps began to register in Malik's consciousness. Not the random footfalls of casual market-goers, but the synchronized, purposeful steps of people moving with military precision. The crowd around them had begun to part, people stepping aside with the kind of deference that suggested someone very important was approaching. Malik turned his head, and his blood ran cold as he saw the group advancing toward him. At the center walked a man whose face was known throughout Burkina Faso and beyond, Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, surrounded by his security detail, but clearly leading the charge himself. The man's face was set in an expression of controlled fury that promised swift and absolute justice. His eyes were locked on Malik's hand where it still gripped Aminata's wrist, and the murderous intent in that gaze was unmistakable. The transformation in the marketplace was immediate and dramatic. What had been a typical scene of commerce and daily life suddenly became an arena where justice would be served. The crowd that had been too frightened to intervene against a local bully now pressed forward eagerly to witness the confrontation between their beloved president and the man who had terrorized their community for far too long. Vendors abandoned their stalls, mothers lifted children onto their shoulders for a better view, and even the elderly men rose from their comfortable spots in the shade to witness what was unfolding. The air itself seemed to crackle with anticipation and the promise of long-overdue retribution. Malik's grip on Aminata's wrist loosened slightly as the full reality of his situation began to penetrate his consciousness. He had built his reputation on intimidating people who couldn't fight back, on exploiting the fear and resignation of those who had no recourse against his abuse. Now, suddenly, he found himself face to face with a man who possessed not only the physical presence to match him, but the authority and power to destroy him completely. Traoré continued his advance, his security details spreading out to ensure that Malik had no avenue of escape. The president's eyes never wavered from their target, and with each step, the weight of his authority seemed to press down on the increasingly panicked bully. "Release her!" Traoré commanded, his voice cutting through the market noise with the authority of absolute power. The words weren't shouted, but they carried with a force that made every person in the vicinity freeze in place. "Release her now!" But Malik, perhaps driven by desperation or a lifetime of unchecked aggression, made the catastrophic decision to double down on his position. Instead of immediately complying, he tightened his grip on Aminata and pulled her closer, using her as a human shield between himself and the approaching president. "Or what?" Malik snarled, his voice cracking slightly with the strain of maintaining, his bravado in the face of overwhelming opposition. "You'll have your soldiers arrest me? For what? Talking to a woman in a public market?" The crowd around them gasped at his audacity. Even in his panic and desperation, Malik was either too stupid or too arrogant to recognize the magnitude of his error. He had just threatened and manhandled the wife of the president of Burkina Faso, and now he was compounding his crime by using her as a shield while challenging the authority of the head of state. One of Traoré's security officers, unable to contain his shock at Malik's continued defiance, stepped forward with his weapon partially drawn. His voice shook with barely controlled rage as he spoke. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to? Any idea at all?" Malik's eyes darted between the president and his security detail, his brain finally beginning to process the military uniforms, the official insignia, the deference being shown by every person in the marketplace. But his response revealed the depth of his delusion and arrogance. "Some government official," he sneered, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Some politician with his bodyguards thinking he can push around honest citizens." The security officer's face darkened with fury. "That's Ibrahim Traoré," he said, his words cutting through the air like bullets. "President of Burkina Faso, and the woman you're manhandling is the first lady of this nation." The effect of these words on Malik was immediate and devastating. The blood drained from his face so quickly that he looked as if he might faint. His grip on Aminata's wrist loosened involuntarily as the full magnitude of his actions crashed down on him like a physical blow. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. His eyes darted frantically between Traoré's implacable face and Aminata's steady gaze, searching for some sign that this was all an elaborate joke or misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding. The respect and deference being shown by every person in the marketplace, the military precision of the security detail, the absolute authority radiating from the man approaching him, all of it confirmed the terrible truth of what he had done. Traoré took another step closer, his presence now so overwhelming that Malik instinctively released Aminata's wrist and stumbled backward. "You put your hands on my wife," the president said, his voice low and deadly. "You threatened her, humiliated her, and terrorized her in front of all these people." As Aminata stepped away from Malik and moved to her husband's side, rubbing her bruised wrist, something remarkable began to happen in the crowd around them. Women who had been silent victims of Malik's abuse for years suddenly found their voices. The presence of their president, the sight of justice finally being served, gave them the courage they had never been able to summon before. An elderly woman, named Mama Hawa, pushed through the crowd, her weathered face set in determined lines. She had been the unofficial guardian of the younger women in the marketplace, trying to protect them from predators like Malik. But her efforts had always been limited by his connections and the community's fear of retaliation. "Mr. President," she called out, her voice strong despite her age, "this man has been terrorizing the women of this market for years. My granddaughter, she's only 16, and he cornered her behind the grain stalls last month. He put his hands on her and told her that no one would believe her if she reported him." Her words opened a floodgate. Other women began to step forward, each adding their voice to a chorus of testimony that had been silenced for far too long. "He knocked over my fruit stand and laughed when my oranges rolled into the dirt," said a young mother, her baby strapped to her back. "When I tried to salvage what I could, he told me I looked like a dog scratching in the dirt for scraps." "He follows the young girls," added another vendor, her voice shaking with remembered fear. "Follows them until they're too scared to come back to the market. Some of them, they lost their only source of income because of him." A teenager, barely out of childhood, spoke up with a trembling voice. "He grabbed me right here in front of everyone and said I was nothing. He said if I disappeared, no one would even notice or care. With each testimony, Malik seemed to shrink further into himself. The confident bully who had terrorized the marketplace for years was being reduced to what he had always been underneath, a coward who preyed on the vulnerable because he was too weak to face anyone who could fight back. Traoré listened to each account with growing fury, his jaw tightening with every story of abuse and intimidation. This wasn't just about the assault on his wife. This was about a systematic campaign of terror against the women of his nation, and it had been allowed to continue far too long. "Get on your knees," Traoré commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of presidential authority. The words weren't a request or a suggestion. They were an order from the head of state to a citizen who had violated the most basic principles of human decency. Malik's legs trembled as he looked around desperately for some avenue of escape, some way to avoid the humiliation and consequences that were now inevitable. But he was surrounded by soldiers, hemmed in by a crowd that had no sympathy for his plight, faced with a president whose authority was absolute. Slowly, reluctantly, Malik sank to his knees on the dusty ground of the marketplace. The same ground, where he had forced others to grovel, where he had humiliated and terrorized innocent people, now became the stage for his own downfall. "Look at them," Traoré commanded, gesturing to the circle of women who had gathered around them. "Look at the women whose lives you've made miserable. Look at the mothers who were afraid to bring their daughters to market because of you." Malik raised his head, and for the first time in years, he was forced to truly see the faces of his victims, not as targets for his abuse, not as objects for his entertainment, but as human beings whose lives he had damaged and whose dignity he had trampled. The faces that looked back at him showed no mercy, no forgiveness, no pity for his current situation. They showed only the accumulated pain and anger of years of abuse, and the satisfaction of finally seeing their tormentor brought low. "I want you to apologize," Traoré continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the marketplace. "Not just to my wife, but to every woman you've harassed, every girl you've frightened, every mother you've humiliated." Malik's voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a whisper. "I'm sorry," he croaked, his throat tight with fear and shame. But the words rang hollow, lacking any genuine remorse or understanding of the harm he had caused. Mama Hawa stepped forward, her old eyes blazing with decades of suppressed anger. "Sorry?" she spat. "You're sorry now? Were you sorry when you made my granddaughter afraid to leave her house? Were you sorry when you destroyed that widow's pottery because she dared to stand up to you?" The old woman's words seemed to unlock something in the other victims, and suddenly they were all speaking at once, their voices rising in a chorus of pain and accusation that had been bottled up for far too long. "He threatened to burn down my stall if I ever spoke against him. He told my daughter she was worthless, that no man would ever want her. He stole money from my purse and dared me to report it. He said the police wouldn't believe us because we're just market women." The testimonies continued, each one adding another layer to the portrait of systematic abuse and intimidation that Malik had perpetrated. With each story, he seemed to crumble further, the reality of his actions finally penetrating the armor of arrogance and entitlement that had protected him for so long. Traoré let the testimonies continue, understanding that this was about more than just punishment. It was about giving voice to the voiceless, about allowing the victims to reclaim their dignity and power. This was the kind of justice that couldn't be dispensed in a courtroom, the kind of healing that could only happen when a community finally stood up to its oppressors. When the testimonies finally subsided, Traoré stepped closer to the kneeling Malik, his presence looming over the broken man like a judgment from on high. "You want to know what real strength looks like?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly across the silent marketplace. "It doesn't look like terrorizing women. It doesn't look like stealing from people who can't fight back. It doesn't look like using fear to control others." He gestured to his wife, who stood straight and proud despite the ordeal she had endured. Real strength looks like her, maintaining dignity under attack, refusing to be broken by a coward's threats. Real strength looks like these women, he continued, indicating the circle of victims who had found the courage to speak. Surviving your abuse, supporting each other, continuing to work and provide for their families despite your efforts to destroy them. Malik wept openly now, his sobs echoing across the marketplace as the full weight of his crimes crashed down on him. But Traoré wasn't finished. This was a teaching moment, not just for Malik, but for everyone present, and he intended to make the most of it. "You called my wife worthless," Traoré continued, his voice rising with controlled passion. "But she is the First Lady of Burkina Faso. She has dedicated her life to improving conditions for women and children in this country. She has more strength, more dignity, more worth in her little finger than you have in your entire body." The crowd erupted in applause, but Traoré raised his hand for silence. "But here's what you failed to understand," he said, his voice becoming deadly serious. "Even if she wasn't the First Lady, even if she was just another market vendor, she would still deserve your respect. Every woman here deserves your respect. Every human being deserves to be treated with dignity." Mama Hawa stepped forward again, her weathered hands clasped in front of her as she addressed the president. "Your Excellency," she said, her voice formal but strong, "we have discussed among ourselves what should be done with this man. May we share our decision?" Traoré nodded, recognizing that true justice in this situation needed to come from the community itself, from the people who had been most directly affected by Malik's reign of terror. "We sentence him to 6 months of service," Mama Hawa announced, her voice carrying clearly across the marketplace. "He will work in this market every day without pay, helping the women he once terrorized. He will carry our baskets, sweep our stalls, and protect the very people he used to abuse." The crowd murmured approval, but the old woman wasn't finished. "And every morning," she continued, her eyes fixed on Malik's bowed head, "he will kneel in this exact spot and apologize to every woman who enters this market. He will acknowledge what he did wrong, and he will ask for forgiveness that may never come." Malik looked up in horror, the full implications of the sentence beginning to dawn on him. 6 months of daily humiliation, 6 months of serving the people he had once terrorized, 6 months of being reminded every single day of his crimes and their consequences. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking, "don't make me do this. I'll leave town. I'll never come back, I promise." But Traoré shook his head firmly. "Running away isn't justice," he said. "Justice is facing the consequences of your actions. Justice is making amends to the people you've wronged. Justice is proving that you can change, that you can become a better man." What happened next was perhaps the most powerful moment of the entire confrontation. One by one, the women of the marketplace began to step forward, not to comfort Malik or offer him easy forgiveness, but to reclaim their space, their power, and their dignity. The young mother, whose fruit had been destroyed, set down a fresh orange in front of Malik. "This represents the food my children didn't have because of you," she said quietly. "Tomorrow, when you start your service, you'll help me sell my fruit, and you'll remember why it matters." The teenager who had been told she was worthless stood tall and proud. "You said no one would notice if I disappeared," she said, her voice stronger than it had ever been. "But I'm here. I'm visible and I matter. And you're going to remember that every day for the next 6 months." Mama Hawa placed a gnarled hand on Malik's shoulder, not in comfort, but in claim. "You belong to us. Now," she said simply, "your time, your labor, your attention, all of it belongs to the women you tried to destroy. And maybe, just maybe, by the time we're done with you, you'll understand what it means to be human." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. The women weren't just claiming their right to justice, they were claiming their power, their space, their absolute right to exist without fear. They were transforming from victims into agents of change, from the oppressed into the architects of justice. As the crowd began to disperse, many stopping to congratulate the women on their courage, and to express their support for the sentence that had been handed down, Traoré addressed the marketplace one final time. "Today we have witnessed something important," he said, his voice carrying the weight of presidential authority, but also the warmth of genuine connection with his people. "We have seen what happens when a community stands together against injustice. We have seen the power that comes from refusing to accept abuse as normal." He looked around at the faces watching him, men, women, and children who represented the heart and soul of Burkina Faso. "But this isn't just about one man or one marketplace," he continued. "This is about the kind of country we want to be. This is about whether we will tolerate those who prey on the vulnerable, or whether we will stand up and say, 'No more.'" The crowd erupted in applause, but Traoré wasn't finished. "I want every man here to understand something," he said, his voice becoming more intense. "The women of Burkina Faso are not your property. They are not your entertainment. They are not objects for your abuse. They are your sisters, your mothers. Your daughters, your wives, they are human beings deserving of respect and dignity." He gestured to his own wife, who stood beside him with quiet dignity. "I am the president of this country, but I am also a husband. And I will not tolerate any man who thinks he can abuse women and get away with it. Not in my country, not on my watch." Over the following days, word of what had happened in the marketplace spread throughout Ouagadougou and beyond. The story was told and retold, growing in power and symbolism with each telling. It became a symbol of justice served, of the powerful being held accountable, of communities finding their voice against oppression. Malik began his sentence the very next morning. He arrived at the marketplace before dawn, his head bowed, his spirit broken. The women were waiting for him, not with cruelty, but with the firm expectation that he would fulfill every aspect of his punishment. Mama Hawa supervised his morning apology ritual, ensuring that he spoke to every woman who entered the market, that he acknowledged his crimes, and that he asked for forgiveness with genuine remorse. It was humiliating, but it was also educational. For the first time in his life, Malik was forced to see his victims as human beings rather than objects. As the days passed, something unexpected began to happen. The daily ritual of service, apology, and acknowledgement began to change Malik in ways that years of threats and punishment had never achieved. Forced to actually help the women he had once terrorized, required to listen to their stories and understand their struggles, he began to develop something he had never possessed before: empathy. The women, for their part, maintained their vigilance, but also began to see small signs of genuine change. Malik's apologies became less mechanical and more heartfelt. His service became less grudging and more genuine. He began to understand, perhaps for the first time, the impact his actions had on real human lives. 6 months later, when Malik's sentence was complete, he was a changed man. The swaggering bully who had terrorized the marketplace had been replaced by someone who understood the value of humility, service, and respect for others. He asked to continue working in the market, not as a punishment, but as a way to contribute to the community he had once tried to destroy. The women, led by Mama Hawa, agreed to let him stay, not out of forgiveness, which was still being earned, but out of recognition that true justice sometimes means giving people the chance to become better than they were. The marketplace itself had been transformed by the events of that day. Where once women had walked with downcast eyes and hurried steps, now they moved with confidence and pride. Where once young girls had avoided certain areas out of fear, now they claimed every inch of the space as their own. The culture of intimidation and abuse that had poisoned the community for years had been replaced by one of mutual respect and collective protection. President Traoré and his wife continued to visit the marketplace regularly, not as a show of power, but as a demonstration of their connection to the people they served. Aminata, in particular, became a symbol of strength and dignity for women throughout the country. Her refusal to be intimidated, her grace under pressure, and her insistence that justice be served had inspired countless others to stand up against their own oppressors. The story of what happened in the Ouagadougou marketplace didn't remain local for long. News of the president's decisive action against a man who had assaulted the First Lady spread throughout West Africa and beyond, becoming a symbol of leadership that prioritized the protection of vulnerable citizens over political expediency. Other marketplaces in other cities began to organize their own systems of community justice, inspired by the model they had witnessed. Women's groups formed mutual protection networks, and men who had previously turned a blind eye to abuse began to speak up when they witnessed mistreatment. The case also had broader implications for law enforcement and judicial procedures throughout Burkina Faso. The fact that Malik had been able to operate with impunity for years, despite multiple complaints, led to a comprehensive review of how cases involving violence against women were handled. New protocols were established to ensure that such complaints were taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. Training programs were implemented for police officers and judicial personnel, focusing on the proper handling of gender-based violence cases. Community liaison programs were established to bridge the gap between law enforcement and local communities, ensuring that people like Malik could no longer hide behind connections or intimidate victims into silence a year after the incident. The marketplace had become something of a pilgrimage site for those interested in community-based justice and women's empowerment. Delegations from other African nations came to study the model that had emerged, examining how a combination of strong leadership, community solidarity, and restorative justice had transformed a place of fear into one of empowerment. Mama Hawa, now recognized as a leader in her own right, often spoke to these visitors about the importance of community involvement in justice. The courts and the police, they have their place, she would say, her weathered hands gesturing expressively. But real change, lasting change, that comes from the community. It comes from people deciding they won't accept abuse anymore, that they won't look the other way when their neighbors are hurt. The young women who had once been Malik's victims had become leaders themselves, organizing workshops on self-defense, economic empowerment, and civic engagement. They understood that their transformation from victims to agents of change represented something larger than their individual stories. It represented the possibility of societal transformation. Malik himself had become an unexpected advocate for change. His genuine transformation, though it took time for people to trust, eventually made him a powerful voice against gender-based violence. He spoke at schools and community centers about the psychology of bullying and abuse, helping young men understand how toxic masculinity and unchecked aggression could destroy both their victims and themselves. President Traoré used the marketplace incident as a catalyst for broader national initiatives focused on gender equality and women's empowerment. New laws were passed strengthening protections against harassment and assault, with stricter penalties and better enforcement mechanisms. But, perhaps more importantly, the cultural shift that began in that dusty marketplace began to spread throughout the country. The idea that women deserved respect and protection, not because of who they were married to or related to, but simply because they were human beings, gained increasing acceptance. Educational curricula were updated to include comprehensive programs on gender equality and respectful relationships. Community leaders were trained to recognize and address signs of domestic violence and abuse. Economic programs were developed to ensure that women had the financial independence necessary to escape abusive situations. The story of Aminata's courage and dignity in the face of assault became part of the national narrative, taught in schools and referenced in political speeches. She used her position as First Lady to advocate for women's rights, but always with the understanding that her power came not from her title, but from her connection to the struggles of ordinary women. The Burkina Faso marketplace model of community-based justice began to attract international attention from human rights organizations, women's advocacy groups, and scholars of conflict resolution. Academic papers were written analyzing the effectiveness of combining traditional community justice with modern legal frameworks. What made the case particularly compelling to international observers was the way it had addressed both individual accountability and systemic change. Malik's punishment hadn't just been about retribution, it had been about rehabilitation, education, and community healing. The focus on service and acknowledgement, rather than simply imprisonment, had created a model that other communities could adapt to their own circumstances. United Nations agencies began including the marketplace case in their training materials for peacekeepers and development workers, highlighting how effective leadership and community engagement could create lasting change without requiring massive external resources or interventions. The story also resonated in countries struggling with similar issues of gender-based violence and community breakdown. From urban slums in Latin America to refugee camps in Asia, community organizers began experimenting with adaptations of the Ouagadougou model, creating their own systems of accountability and healing. 5 years after the incident, researchers and policymakers had identified several key factors that made the marketplace intervention so successful. Leadership. By example, President Traoré's willingness to personally intervene, rather than delegating the matter to subordinates, sent a powerful message about priorities and values. His decision to treat the assault on his wife not as a personal affront, but as an attack on all women, demonstrated genuine commitment to equality. Community ownership. Rather than imposing punishment from above, Traoré allowed the community, particularly the women who had been victimized, to determine appropriate consequences. This created buy-in and ensured that the solution addressed the real needs and concerns of those most affected. Restorative rather than punitive focus. The emphasis on service, apology, and education rather than simple punishment created opportunities for genuine transformation and healing that traditional criminal justice approaches often failed to achieve. Addressing root causes. The intervention didn't just deal with one incident of abuse, it addressed the entire culture of intimidation and impunity that had allowed such behavior to flourish. This comprehensive approach prevented the problem from simply recurring with different perpetrators. Symbolic power. The public nature of both the crime and the consequences created a powerful symbol that resonated far beyond the immediate participants. This amplified the impact and helped spread cultural change more broadly. The marketplace in Ouagadougou continued to serve as a symbol of what was possible when communities refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Visitors often remarked on the atmosphere of mutual respect and collective pride that characterized interactions between vendors and customers, men and women, young and old. But those who looked deeper understood that this transformation hadn't happened overnight and wasn't maintained without constant effort. The women's groups that had emerged from the crisis continued to meet regularly, supporting each other through challenges and celebrating successes. They had created networks of mutual aid that extended far beyond the marketplace itself, encompassing schools, neighborhoods, and workplaces throughout the city. Malik, now middle-aged and gray-haired, had become something of a fixture in the marketplace, but in a completely different role than he had once played. Children who didn't remember his reign of terror knew him only as the quiet man who helped their mothers carry heavy loads and who always had time to listen to their problems. His transformation remained a source of wonder and sometimes skepticism, but it also served as proof that even the most hardened individuals could change given the right circumstances and incentives. The annual commemoration of Marketplace Justice Day had become a national holiday, not to celebrate revenge or punishment, but to honor the courage of those who stand up to injustice and the power of communities to heal themselves. Schools organized special programs, community groups held discussions about conflict resolution and reconciliation, and government officials recommitted themselves to protecting the vulnerable. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the marketplace incident was its effect on young people who grew up hearing the story. A generation of children had been raised with the understanding that abuse would not be tolerated, that communities had the power to protect their vulnerable members, and that real strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them. Young men who might have otherwise followed paths similar to Malik's instead found themselves channeled toward community service and positive leadership roles. They had seen the consequences of choosing intimidation over cooperation, and they had also seen how much more fulfilling it could be to be respected rather than feared. Young women had grown up with role models like Aminata and Mama Hawa, understanding that they didn't have to accept mistreatment as inevitable. They learned to recognize the early warning signs of abusive behavior and developed the skills and confidence necessary to seek help when needed. The economic impact was also significant. The marketplace, once a place where many women feared to go alone or avoided entirely, became a thriving center of commerce where female entrepreneurs flourished. The removal of the climate of fear had allowed business relationships to develop based on trust and mutual benefit rather than intimidation and exploitation. The story that began with one man's decision to assault a woman in a crowded marketplace had evolved into something far larger, a testament to the power of moral courage, community solidarity, and transformative justice. It demonstrated that even in the face of seemingly entrenched patterns of abuse and intimidation, change was possible when people were willing to stand up for what was right. President Ibrahim Traoré's intervention that day had been about more than protecting his wife, though that was certainly important. It had been about establishing a principle that would guide his administration and, hopefully, his nation for years to come, that the measure of a society was how it treated its most vulnerable members. Aminata's courage and dignity in the face of assault had inspired countless other women to refuse to accept mistreatment as inevitable. Her insistence that the incident be seen not as a personal attack, but as part of a broader pattern of abuse had helped focus attention on systemic issues rather than just individual crimes. Mama Hawa and the other women who had found their voices that day had created a model of community-based justice that balanced accountability with compassion, punishment with rehabilitation, and individual healing with social transformation. Even Malik's story had become part of the larger narrative, proof that even those who seemed irredeemable could change when confronted with the full consequences of their actions and given the opportunity to make amends. The marketplace in Ouagadougou remained a bustling center of commerce and community life, but it had become something more as well, a symbol of hope, a reminder that ordinary people had the power to create extraordinary change when they refused to accept injustice as normal. As visitors to the marketplace often observed, the real lesson of what had happened there wasn't about presidential power or dramatic confrontations. It was about the quiet, daily work of treating each other with dignity and respect, of standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves, and of never giving up on the possibility that people and communities could become better than they were. The legacy of that dusty afternoon when justice was served would continue to inspire future generations, reminding them that the power to create change didn't reside in distant capitals or foreign interventions, but in the choices ordinary people made every day about how to treat their neighbors, their families, and their communities. In the end, the marketplace had taught a lesson that resonated far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. That justice wasn't just about punishment, that leadership wasn't just about power, and that real change happened not when people were forced to behave differently, but when they chose to become different. The story that had begun with violence and intimidation had become a story of transformation and hope, a reminder that even in the darkest situations, the human capacity for growth and redemption could create light.